Strategies can be copied. The part that I think is less likely to be copied is the culture, the people, the systems that bring your strategy to life. So really the heart and soul of your organization.
This is Momentum with Sidekick, the podcast that explores what's shifting in business and leadership and what it can mean for you right now.
I'm Bonny, and this is Nora. We're both from Sidekick, where we help leaders turn complexity into clarity and ideas into action.
So let's dive in.
Okay, here we are again.
Excited to be back.
What I want to talk to you about today.
Okay.
I've been seeing these things.
Oh, no.
Culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Oh, wow.
And it always sounds so competitive. Like one's better than the other.
Yeah.
But it got me thinking. So I think it's worth a conversation.
Sounds good.
So when I see that, I go like, yeah, culture, strategy, how do they relate? And it started to mean something to me. So even though I do think both really kind of need to go hand in hand, maybe that's the point of it. The fact that kind of right now, this sentiment is turning into like culture eats strategy for breakfast, I think is for a reason. So strategy, I think we all know is truly like important for any business to kind of have. And it is what sets them apart, what differentiates them. At Sidekick, we always like to define it as kind of that set of choices that you make for your business to win.
Yeah.
And whether it's
love
win
that.
or succeed, to have the impact that you want to have as an organization. But we've also been talking about kind of the rise of AI and where kind of all the creativity and the thinking and everyone has access to all of these resources. So it got me thinking about like, is strategy in the long run going to be the thing that's really kind of unique or differentiating for organizations? Like, I think in theory, or arguably, strategies can be copied. The part that I think is less likely to be copied is the culture, the people, the systems that bring your strategy to life. So really the heart and soul of your organization. So that's where I started to kind of maybe get on board with the expression of culture eats strategy for breakfast a little bit, because especially in these times with AI changes and kind of focusing in even more on like your human value, your human capacities, along with geopolitical shifts and kind of a bit of tension on like, where do we belong and what are your, like that sense of belonging or lack thereof, I think. As well as hybrid work that we also have been talking about, like remote work. How does that play into kind of bringing your strategy and your business to life? So a lot of things shifting in the world that I think are making a case for culture becoming more relevant and important than it already is.
Totally. Within professional walls, outside of professional walls, I think there's like a lot to unpack there. And I'm so on board because I do think for all of the circumstances that you painted there, culture is what can unite and divide people. And we don't need to explain that then more than, living today. That's seen pretty clearly. And I've done a lot of reading on this and it's popping up everywhere. But cultures have really changed, like let's focus on inside of professional walls. Cultures have really changed over the last 5 years. There was some work done now that we're coming up to kind of the 5-year anniversary of the pandemic and things shutting down, and that really being quite radical for people in a short time. Yeah. So there's a lot of kind of studies coming out. And there was one that was looking at, I think Gallup did it, of 65% of the companies, and I think it was 5,000 organizations that they surveyed, said their organizational culture has radically shifted.
In the last 5 or 10 years or
5 years.
5 years, yeah.
Like radically is like an extreme word to be using. So I agree. It's shifting. And I don't think this conversation necessarily needs to be about if culture matters, but it's more like, how is it formed? How does it evolve? Like, what's happening for those 65% of the 5,000, whatever that math is, and how do we evolve with it?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So it's a key question, I think, is knowing that so many organizational cultures have shifted. There might be something there of like what got us here is not going to get us there, or it was just not working anymore. Strategies may have shifted, and cultures may have had to shift along with it, or maybe they shifted and then caused a strategy. So it's kind of where does it start and stop, and how does it interact with strategy? How does it get formed? How does it evolve? So culture eating strategy for breakfast. Maybe it's more around who are the cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah. And what's your role in it?
Yeah. So let's take a closer look at that and kind of, as we usually do, explore, and then we'll promise at the end we'll
bring it back,
make it make sense. Starting with how does culture form? In doing a bit of research, I found like roughly three schools of thought. So there is this notion of leadership shapes culture, culture by design. And I think that is also personally kind of what I have been embracing over the last, I don't know, decade or so. It's the Gallup, HBR, Shine. That's kind of the language that's often used, kind of nurturing, designing, building culture. So that's one. Then there is a second one that is a lot more organic. The belief that culture emerges naturally. Put a group of people together and a culture will arise. Smirkic is one of the researchers and founding thought leaders in that field. And then there is the third stream of culture follows structure and systems. So you should first kind of fix and build your organization, and that will dictate how culture gets formed. So I think when I look at kind of the clients that we work with, and most modern organizations tend to believe in a bit of a mix of all, right? And they kind of embrace this messy middle that we love to talk about.
Yeah.
So they all have to navigate that tension between control and evolution. And I always it's very simple, but the example or analogy around a garden, if you don't tend to a garden, it will grow. If you intentionally water it, put some nutritions in, you will shape how it grows. You might trim and cut here and there.
Yeah.
So that is also that analogy of like part evolution and will form itself, part nurturing, designing, but where do you take that? Like what's effective in that messy middle? So curious to kind of explore that.
And in those three schools of thought, when I was listening to them, it's a bit of like, does culture lead or does it follow? Right. And that feels a bit like linear to me. So I like this like messy middle. Right. And I think of, like I am a big fan of like Galbraith's STAR model, the strategy, structure, process, and then kind of cultures last. But in our work, we've kind of evolved it in our adaptive transformation to put it right in the middle. It's like, it's the hub that connects all of those spokes. It's the piece that, is the jelly part that's got to form and shift and shake, which I really like. But also in those three, you use the word design a couple of times, which I'm kind of like, design. Like it starts to feel like, can this be engineered? Is this scientific and goes in a petri dish and you can do these things, right? Is there a secret sauce or recipe, right? It feels kind of controlling, almost manipulative to some extent, which is taking it far. So it kind of gives me like the ick. Like I'm like, I don't like that. So maybe I'm more of the like, it evolves, right? We all play an intentional role, but let it evolve. So maybe I'm showing my bias already. But it also gets me thinking outside of the professional walls. And our team has done a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot of work, but some intentional work around understanding Indigenous worldviews, and did that University of Alberta course. And there was a lot of conversation in that around Indigenous worldviews or collectivist worldviews, where collectivists is they prioritize the group over the individual. And their culture evolves on its own, but is based off of relationships, reciprocity, and rituals, right? For the collective. And I think there's something in that too. So this already going by design, I was just like, ooh, got my back up. But
And I agree. Design is like more of the Western worldview perspective, right? So interesting how cultural differences influence how you look at culture.
So meta.
But yeah, that Western worldview, I think, has that risk of cultural overreach is a term that I kind of picked up on, where there is this belief that you can truly codify it, and we've all kind of seen the examples of like the value town hall or the words on the wall, and no one actually know what they mean, or it's just kind of they're developed in silos or top down, or at least there hasn't been kind of this more collective approach, whether it starts there or whether it is more kind of the change management approach to kind of implementing things or change. So yeah, and I think another example relevant to kind of the trends that are happening in the world is like you see a lot of organizations mandating people to get back into the office, right? Which I think to me is another potential example of overreach, where it is you think you can just design it by forcing people to sit together again, but that might have effects on your culture that I'm not sure are fully being thought through. Yeah. Similar to how remote work also affects your culture, right? So there is something around some things will evolve naturally. But maybe there is something in how do you shape the conditions around it. And then what I found in a Gallup research too is that, and that kind of addresses that overreach, cultural overreach, 70% of culture tends to be driven by immediate managers and peers.
Immediate managers and peers.
So not the boardroom,
right?
The HR department, the policies.
Yeah,
it's truly due to behavior, habits, actions that are happening in your immediate surroundings.
That's cool. Yeah, this shift, it evolves, it changes with circumstances. It makes me think of a couple of examples. Looking on one end, this concept of microcultures. That is much, and if folks aren't familiar with it, to me, it means there's kind of smaller groups that have shared identity, shared roles, shared passions, whatever it may be in a greater organization. How if you don't over control, like we all must be, every department must subscribe to the same thing, but allow for those microcultures to form, maybe that helps the overall adaptability. You see microcultures in sports, and I chuckle anytime I'm with my brother and his old university football friends, where it's like, okay, the wide receiver guys that are together are this, the linebackers are like this. Like they all have these little microcultures, depending on their position. You see it in some religions, Christianity. There's a whole bunch of microcultures within there. So how can, in a professional setting, microcultures be to your benefit? And then you see the over controlling, and there's great examples, and a lot of them, that come to mind are startups, or what started as startups and are no longer startups, but very successful tech companies, where that like hustle, grind, do what you got to do culture of Uber, Hootsuite, that started, and now they've evolved. And then it leads to burnout. People are leaving. In some cases like Hootsuite, they caught it and figured it out. In other places like Uber, it got really toxic. There was senior leadership changes and it didn't work out, right?
Yeah.
So you look at both sides of those, of like trying to hold on to something and be too rigid in your culture, and then also embracing microcultures so long as they kind of ladder up and connect together. Is that okay too?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, so there are some examples of like where culture had to evolve kind of with circumstances. I think there are situations too where there's an intentional choice to change culture because it's no longer serving a certain purpose. And sometimes it just grows, adapts, and outgrows us. Yeah. Maybe without us even noticing it in time, right? So I think there's a bit of a question around like, when you finally get it right, if there's even such a thing, can a culture be too strong or too rigid too, right? So I've always wondered when people refer to a culture as like, oh, they have a really strong culture there and there. What does it
What does a strong culture mean?
Is it like it's very clear and everyone behaves the same and everyone knows what to expect? Is that a strong culture? Is a strong culture? Do people use that to reference to it's a great culture? It's good. Like everyone wants to work there. Because I can and then you have like toxic cultures where I would tend to believe that that's a very a form of a strong culture too, but probably not what you want. And a colleague of ours always references this company that she used to work with, where she was a consultant and worked with this company 10 years ago and then 10 years later again. And there were certain things that even though the whole leadership team has shifted, their whole business strategy had changed, that kind of notion of like, if you book a meeting with a VP of another department, you cannot show up without the VP of your own department, which that to me is an example of a very strong culture that I don't necessarily have an opinion on whether that's good or bad, but just an example of how cultures can be so strong that it kind of that they outlive leadership changes, strategy changes, things like that.
Yeah.
I do think the real question is, where does a strong culture, in the sense of like it's clear everyone kind of behaves a certain way, it outlives changes, where does that stop serving you potentially? Where can it get too rigid?
Yeah. That's a great question. And just going back to that VP example, like I think of in a couple places I've worked, this concept of like first team and second team is like been very core to their culture, right? Of like you have your first team, your peer group, and who you report to. That is your first team and your first culture. And then you have your second team, which is the second one. So it just that example is like, oh, it's kind of like that first team, second team culture, or that like live model, laterally integrate before you vertically execute. But those are all examples of routines or habits or things that will live beyond. And I wonder if it's still happening now that I think back on it. But yeah, that the question that you ask the messy middle piece keeps coming back to me, right? Mm-hmm. And I reflected, in advance of this, of like various corporate cultures that I've been a part of. Ones with our clients where you get to temporarily be a part of it, which is a really fun part of our job, that you get to like have these little moments where you get to embed yourself and be part of a different group. But I think there's this tension in what I would call coherence, while also being very open. So coherence being is your culture rooted in your vision and why you guys exist as an organization? Is there a level of predictability that everybody knows what's expected of them and how they contribute to that and what positive behavior or contributions look like to doing that? And do you have a positive reinforcing cycle to reinforce those things? Yeah. Which again, doesn't have to be a leader standing up there saying those things. Like I've seen it where anybody can be part of creating that. So that's a coherence piece, which to me is about belonging, consistency, united, stronger together kind of piece. But then I think that rigidity piece, if you're too much that's where you become too rigid and the culture might be left behind or hold you back from something or backfire on you. The other side to me is this openness that allows for that adaptability, flexibility, innovation. But you can't just show up and be like, we are an open culture. Like that drives me nuts when I hear that. There are some key pieces around trust in your culture that has to be the table stakes for that to happen. And I do find, and I've probably been guilty of it, so come at me in the comments, of like this speaking out of both sides of your mouth, right? Of like, we are adaptable, we are flexible, we are innovative, a culture of experimentation, but there is not a foundation of trust that anyone feels safe enough to speak up, that their opinions will be heard, their different perspectives are being welcomed. So how do you get that level of psychological safety, trust? I think of the trust quotient in there. How do you embrace your organization on that? So I think those are two pieces. If you can keep them together, you won't fall into this pitfall of being too rigid and things will move past you.
Yeah. So coherence and openness.
Yeah.
As you were speaking, I was also thinking the rigidity could also come in, like, and we'll get to that probably a bit later when we kind of unfold, like, how do you keep a culture alive, or in what components does it show up? But if you hire people that fit perfectly with your culture and you have your culture defined very, like, in a very rigid way, then there is a bit of that risk of hiring all the same people, right? Like, where is your diversity of thought or kind of your inclusion?
Yeah.
So I see that as a bit of a risk too. The openness, I think, also really, to me, feeds into that notion of adaptability, right? So it is, sure, some things are really defining your organization and align with your purpose and your strategy, but then is there enough openness or space to evolve with the world around us? And research shows that, and it's Cotter and Haskett who did this research, that adaptive cultures outperform rigid ones by 4 times.
Wow.
So gets us into that space of, like, why are we even talking about culture? Which I think, in my mind, it's a bit about employee engagement, which I think is always the obvious connection that's made. It's about customer satisfaction and kind of a customer loyalty, and then business performance at large. Like, another stat that I found, or that McKinsey found, I found that McKinsey found, is that inclusive cultures are 36% more profitable. So that's kind of all around the business performance side of it. Then there is kind of, I think, the employee engagement side, another research more on the negative side, like toxic cultures are 10 times more predictable of turnover than pay salaries, which we always tend to think, like, is what draws people out. But yeah, so culture can really work against you if it's not right. What I loved seeing in examples is kind of Wealthsimple, and then it's looking at culture more from a, like, industry perspective, like the financial industry. I don't think has been known for their flexibility and openness and wellness and kind of giving everyone a voice. And Wealthsimple, to me, is an example that really, really broke through that, despite the culture in the industry. And I don't know enough about how they did it. I would be curious kind of to dive into that a little bit more, because how are you going to attract the very same finance people that worked in that industry for years and then together work in this whole new context? So you really have to shape the right conditions for people to feel safe enough and to open up about things like wellness and to create that flexibility and not the 90-hour work weeks type of thing, right?
Yeah.
So I really admire, and I would be curious to learn more how they did it, but I do know they did do it.
And they're still, the greater scheme of things, like a young organization, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious to follow their journey as well, going through it. And I do love the connection to culture does equal business performance. So if you're an organization that's a big part of your culture and what's important to you, like, it's great to see that, right? More productive, better revenue results, lower turnover, less stress. Like, think about that as the place you want to work, right? Like, you're doing well and you're having fun and you're not feeling stressed about it. Like, that sounds pretty cool, right? So it sounds like it's
also
worth
not
investing
the ping pong
in.
tables and the
Ping pong tables, free lunch.
Where it is.
I mean, those are nice too from time to time. But and another example that comes to mind that I'm just, like, such a huge fan of this organization. It feels weird calling it an organization, but Four Seasons, like the hotel chain, right? They're Canadian, so gotta represent. Wish I could go to Four Seasons more often, but they're too expensive for me. But I've been at one twice, and it was incredible. But I think they have a book about the Golden Rule principle, and maybe I read it 15, 20 years ago when I first started in a customer service role, and our leader was like, we want to, let's read this. We don't have to have the golden rule ourselves, but, like, listen in a customer service team, which sometimes in a customer service team, you feel like the afterthought in the greater organization. Like, we play a pivotal role in this. What do we want our team culture to be? And so their big mantra was around the golden rule.
Yeah.
Do unto others as you would have do unto you. Sounds familiar. Pretty simple, but it works, right? And they really, focused on how do we create that culture of trust with our team? We're in the service industry, that every single person, no matter what your position is, you feel like you have the runway to do what you need to do to make that guest stay 10 times better.
Yeah.
You don't have to ask anybody. You just do it. We trust your judgment, right? And from there, the benefits on the internal trust of like delivering incredible service, people staying around, like they are a huge, very popular chain known for these experiences. And then you look at the external trust that was created of customer loyalty. People will move mountains to have their type of experiences. Like I think there's something quite powerful in that example and how simplistic it was. Their culture came down to the golden rule, which is pretty cool.
I think that's an amazing example, especially kind of how it connects also to like customer loyalty, right? So it is kind of connecting that internal and external world. And in its simplicity, I think it's how I would define a strong culture. Like I'm sure it survived or like it still exists. So there must have been leadership changes. There must have been strategic choices that were made differently. But this is the thing that kind of kept being their number one thing driving their culture. The how they do it or how everyone does it is so open that everyone can kind of give their own interpretation to it, but it leads to the same thing. So I think there's, again, that kind of adaptability from a role to role, person to person within that, and a strong alignment with their vision and strategy. So I think maybe that brings us to like, a culture is not something that you just create once and for all.
Not a crock pot. You don't set it and forget it.
It kind of needs to be strong enough to mean something, but also adaptable enough to kind of allow for that openness that we talked about.
And you go to like the past 5 years and the 65% that have changed. And I'm curious to know how many of them came through the other side and would say they're stronger as an organization, better performance, and was the ability that what their culture was at the beginning and whatever it adapted to is what got them through it, right?
Yeah.
I feel like maybe there's a research study for us in there.
Yeah.
So going to, it's not a set it and forget it. And for folks listening, this is not about protecting or policies or designing, none of those words. But, the shaping conditions, I think, is what you've called. And what can you do no matter what your role is, right? It's 2 weeks on the job. You're a senior executive. You're a team lead with a group of 6 people, like whatever it may be. What are some of the things that you can do or can think about and how you show up in those places or help create those conditions or reinforce those conditions? And when we were chatting about this before, we kind of came down to like 5 drivers. Yeah. Let's call them that. Let's see how my memory goes. There's a piece around leadership. There's a piece around structure. There's a piece around values and rituals.
Yep.
There's a piece around metrics. And I think most importantly, what makes it work? People.
Yeah.
Right. So I think for folks listening, like think about how you can engage in those. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of them. Because when I do think they're like a good 5 areas to think about.
Yeah. And they are the 5 areas where you can shape conditions or kind of, how you keep a culture alive or things that impact your culture. So the first one you mentioned is leadership. And I do think kind of there's a bit of a paradox in there or a myth that it is solely driven by leadership, which I personally don't believe. But I do think leadership still plays a big role in kind of what you reward, what you recognize, how you communicate, but also the things that you ignore are signs to people of what you value. And they are, whether you want it or not, they are impacting your culture. So I've been in an organization where we had a group of team leads and one was significantly underperforming. And I that's not even the right word for it, but it was clearly someone who was just not in the right seat. They had wonderful talents and skill sets, but just not the ones that were needed for that
They
role.
couldn't thrive.
They couldn't thrive. And as a result of it, their team was not thriving, right? They were staying behind, and kind of that just trickled down to everyone around this person. And I think we as senior leadership waited way too long with taking action on that. Not realizing enough what an impact it had on all the people around it, and what it was kind of signaling of like, well, if he can do that, everyone can do it. We clearly don't value having the right people in the right seats. And as soon as action was taken and the person moved on to another role, new team lead stepped in, that team was thriving. So like individual talents kept kind of showed up from like very unexpectedly, right? So
Very cool.
that was a really good learning in if you signal something like that, sometimes not doing anything is worse than taking the harder decision or harder path. So I think we already said 70% of culture is shaped by your direct kind of managers and peers. And the other component, and I think it is as much leadership as other people in the organization, but the power of storytelling. I read another HBR article on it, how in driving cultural change, they did research and kind of where that successfully happened, and what the key piece that made the difference was not starting with a workshop to discuss our values or changing our HR policies. It was in all cases the stories that were told. And it had to be stories, or kind of what the stories shared in how they were told is they were authentic. They were about the people who told the story. So they were kind of authentic and about themselves. Theatrical in a way. So like enough for people to kind of engage with and really kind of buy into. So combining heart and mind, and empowering. So it was showing behavior of a culture that was desired and against kind of the current cultural norms, but celebrated in a way, and showing others like, you can do this too.
Yeah.
Right? It's showing the path.
Yeah. It wasn't a department that I was in, but like a department that worked very closely with us. They did at the beginning of every Friday's team meeting, kudos.
Oh,
So
yeah.
everybody
Yeah, I love
wrote
that.
it down, put in a hat, and it's quite simple, right? And they all stood up from their desk, stood in a circle. And that was that example of storytelling, right? They were a sales team that were just giving her all the time. They did not have easy jobs by any means. And I thought it was great of that director to just create that moment, that the stories weren't coming from her. It was the greater team of 20 of them sharing stories, which I thought was pretty cool.
Which is also a ritual.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. That, which is a great example of totally a ritual and bringing those storytelling in. And, other values and rituals to me are kind of like the ways of working, right? Like these habits that start to form. And yes, they're in professional settings, but I think a lot of people think of rituals or traditions in family settings, friendships, those things that bring a group together, right? And one that a kind of icebreaker or warm-up activity we like to do in some of our sessions with folks is you're all sitting down at a big holiday dinner, depending on whatever the time of year is. We pick a big holiday. With Thanksgiving in Canada just passed and coming up in the US, let's say it's Thanksgiving dinner. We're all sitting down. What would be the dish that you would bring, right? So there's that sentiment that comes. So I think it's like interesting on how rituals just outside of work also like to give some context for that. But I do think they're the ways of working and the glue that holds people together. And, I've heard of, sharing your failure moments, like your F up moments, whatever you want to call them. Our team at the beginning of each of our team meetings, it's not only complicated, but we went, what's one thing that worked this weekend or week? Not weekend. What's one thing that worked this week and one thing that didn't? And what is your best news of the week, right? Yeah. And it's just interesting sharing those learnings and building that connection and super simple to do. But I think paired with that is like we can't underestimate the structure side of things, right?
Yep.
So when you have your vision, your purpose, how you set up and organize yourselves is also very, very important. And I mentioned organizations in silos, like when they're in silos, it's so important that you're like, okay, why are they in silos? And then is that contributing to like these pain points and these friction points and these rubs that they have? So I think it's really important to make sure that your culture and your structure are in sync with one another. Because if you have a structure, it may not reinforce your values and your culture and vice versa. So I think that's important to think about.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you value collaboration or want to create a culture where people collaborate, and you then structure your organization in a way that there's no incentive or value for one silo to work
Or
with
it's not
another,
easy to do it.
It's not going to work.
No.
Right. I think people is another one that you mentioned. Obviously, I mean, we should have started with it. I do believe people both carry and create the culture. There's something around aligning the people that you hire and the people kind of that you try to make loyal to your organization. Who are they? And I do think there is this point of like coherence versus openness and making sure that it doesn't become too rigid and exclusive. So at least if that is what you value kind of in diverse thinking, maybe I assumed that everyone thinks that's important. But the people really carry and create culture.
Yeah.
That's ultimately kind of where
Totally.
it's formed.
Totally.
And then metrics matter too. And we talked about it in our recovery episode a lot. What you measure is what matters, and what you don't measure doesn't get attention.
Yeah.
So if you really value kind of wellness, having an equal voice, how are you kind of incentivizing that, encouraging that, measuring it, having it show up in ways that people see that it is valued?
Yeah. And in Jay Galbraith's STAR model, like one of the last steps is rewards specifically for that. What you reward will continue, right? And you said it earlier, it's also what you don't reward. And people pick it up.
Yeah.
They're like, okay, I'm doing all this and no one's noticing it, so I'm not going to do it anymore. And then you stop and they're like, wait a second, where did that go? Like, so it's interesting to think about what are you subconsciously or consciously measuring, rewarding, not measuring, not rewarding. But, in bringing this all together, I don't want people to leave being like, okay, as the team lead, I've got to do these 5 drivers and I got to think this, coherence, openness, like it's a lot, right?
Yeah.
But I think on that people piece, there's a lot of, and our colleague Carlton at True Blue Inclusion says this to me all the time, and I think it's fabulous, is there is ownership and authorship.
Yeah.
So there is that co-authorship. And if you're someone that likes to take charge of some situations and like to know what's going on, just like let people be and see what naturally starts to evolve a little bit and what they will start to co-author together. And there will be friction. I think of culture as, especially in growing teams or with lots of external factors, as an elastic band. It's going to feel like it's going to stretch, but if it's strong enough, it will never snap. You just got to let it stretch and it will just grow, and you got to go with it. Right. So also don't think like, oh, we're having disagreements or there's friction, we have a bad culture. Like that probably means you could have
It's
a really
evolving.
healthy one
Yeah,
and it
yeah,
could change.
Yeah. So I think, like we always do, we went from like exploring to already getting into a bit more like tangible. How do you influence? How do you shape it, create the conditions?
Yeah.
But maybe quickly back to, is it by design or by default? Kind of, we had those 3 schools of thought. I think what we share in our beliefs is that you cannot control culture or command it into existence, right?
Yeah.
But you can shape the conditions for a culture to grow trust, curiosity, connection.
Yep.
Shape the conditions for it.
Yep.
And something around like that, coherence, openness, I would summarize as the best cultures are strong enough to mean something, but open enough to evolve or keep learning.
Yeah. Yeah. And I, again, don't want folks to walk away thinking like, oh, we all need to hold hands and Yeah, like that's not it either, right? There are some, I like that it has to be strong enough to stand for something, but can also evolve and create something great. And there's some cultures where hierarchy, very tightened, button up military cultures like are the best, strongest culture and work there, right? So it's figuring out what fits for you, which I think is excellent. So maybe on that note, 3 things that I'm taking away from this is, again, that like it's not all on your shoulders as a leader by any means. So be a steward, be the kind of the one that helps guide and create those conditions. Don't be the sculptor. Don't feel like you have to over control or over influence. Be very observant to what is going on to help shape those conditions. I think 2 is this like ownership and authorship, like share the pen, right? How is this being co-authored every day and highlight those moments and then create that space for it to adapt. Don't be fearful. It is can be scary when things start to change, right? But I do think the best cultures and the strongest cultures will evolve, and it is that elastic band. They will not break, but they'll continue to stretch and are truly strong at the heart of it.
So let's get to your favorite part, the challenge to our listeners.
I love it.
I would kind of pose the question of like, look for a place where in your team, in your organization, can you create some space for your culture to evolve? So think about habits, rituals, beliefs that your team or your organization can either let go of, adapt, or adopt. I'll leave you with that question.
And let us know what happens. Well, thanks for listening to Momentum with Sidekick today. If you'd enjoyed the conversation, follow us, subscribe, put your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear how you are building and creating momentum in your everyday. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.